I'm Sherry Paula Watkins, Executive Director of the North Carolina Humanities Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening to the NASCAR Hall of Fame for tonight's panel discussion on Driving with the Devil, the fifth and final book in our North Carolina Reads program series. I also want to say a special welcome to those who are joining us via live stream on YouTube. I'd like to first acknowledge the passing of NASCAR Hall of Famer Bruton Smith and his deep contributions and impact of his life to this sport and to our topic of tonight's panel. At North Carolina Humanities, we bring subject matter experts and community members together to learn about and discuss topics that are important to both our nation and North Carolina. The resulting conversations help expand our understanding, respect, and empathy for each other's stories and experiences, enriching the lives of North Carolinians around the state. In honor of our 50th anniversary, we wanted to feature books about American perseverance and diversity. That's why this year, our North Carolina Reads statewide book club featured 5 books that explored issues of racial, social, and gender equality and the history and culture of North Carolina. We have had so much fun reading and learning with you, and we were overwhelmed by the enthusiasm you all showed throughout the series. Thank you. Earlier this year, we distributed over 3,000 free books, reading guides, and materials to libraries, book groups, and community colleges across North Carolina. Starting in February, we invited you to attend free book discussions like this one tonight with our North Carolina Reads authors and topic experts to deepen our understanding of the content and to increase our empathy with each other. During this series, we read in February, Soul City, Race, Equality, and the Lost Dream of an American Utopia by Thomas Healy. In March, The Last Ballad by Wiley Cash. In April, Even As We Breathe by Annette Sanook Clapsaddle. In May, Pauli Murray, A Personal and Political Life by Troy R. Saxby. And tonight, we will discuss the book we read in June, Driving with the Devil, Southern Moonshine, Detroit Wheels, and the Birth of NASCAR by Neal Thompson. Each of these discussion programs were recorded and are available to watch on our website. Tonight's program is also being recorded and will be available afterwards. You are welcome and invited to visit our website and to share our links with family and friends that might be interested in hearing these conversations that are rich in North Carolina history and culture. At this time, I want to thank tonight's sponsors and partners: the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Erik Jones Foundation, Devil's Logic Brewing, and the NASCAR Hall of Fame. We are so appreciative of your support. During the past several months, we have enjoyed partnering with the Erik Jones Foundation, promoting children's literacy. Please visit our website to learn more about this unique partnership. Plus, you can hear and see Erik Jones reading. I also want to thank tonight's moderator, Brian Kahn, one of our board trustees, and our special guests who are with us this evening, including Neal Thompson, Erik Jones, and Daniel Pierce. I also want to thank Melissa Giblin, our director of the North Carolina Center for the Book, who has put together our first in-person event since COVID in March of 2020. It's hard to believe, but thank you all for being here, and thank you again for tuning in if you are live tonight via YouTube. A little bit more about Brian. Brian Kahn is a litigation partner at McGuire Woods Law Firm, specializing in complex commercial litigation, financial services, and class action. Much more interestingly, though, he is the father of triplet boys plus one more, and also the writer and co-producer of Charlotte Squawks, an annual music parody poking fun at Charlotte sports, politics, and Pop Culture, which is running now through this Sunday at the Booth Theater, just a few blocks from here. My partner and I, Bob and I, just went to see that. And if you need to laugh, and I think we all need to laugh, I hope you will go see that and enjoy the creative side of Brian Kahn and others there. And now it's my pleasure to turn the event over to Brian Kahn to introduce our panelists and lead us in a great discussion. Brian?
Thank you so much, Sherry Paula, and thank you everybody on the staff for helping put this together. We're so excited to be here. Nobody wants to hear me talk, so I'm going to dive right in, introduce our guests, and get the conversation going. So first, I'm just going to go right down the line. First, right here to my left is Neal Thompson, who's a journalist and author of 6 highly acclaimed books, including Driving with the Devil, which I know you've all read and you're here to talk about. As a former reporter, Neal has written for national publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Esquire, Men's Health, Wall Street Journal, all the small ones, right? He's also appeared on NPR, PBS, The Daily Show, which is really cool, ESPN, the History Channel, and others. He lives in Seattle, so he gets the prize for the longest trip out here to see us as well. So welcome, Neal.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone.
All right, next up, Erik Jones, who gets the prize for the shortest trip here. He's up at Mountain Island Lake. He is the 2015 NASCAR Camping World Truck Series champion and currently competes full-time in the NASCAR Cup Series, the big one. In 2021, Erik began the Erik Jones Foundation, which encourages early cancer detection and care, promotes animal welfare, and igniting a passion for childhood reading. Welcome, Erik.
Thanks for having me.
And third, but certainly not least, Dr. Daniel Pierce is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. His books include Tar Heel Lightning, which is about racing, not about the Tar Heel school, right?
Yeah. About moonshine.
Okay, there you go. It's about moonshine. Real NASCAR, White Lightning, Red Clay, and Big Bill France. He earned a PhD from the University of Tennessee, and his research interests include environmentalism, environment in the Southern Appalachian region, Southern and Southern Appalachian culture, stock car racing, and NASCAR. So this is exciting. We got a great group of panelists here. Let's dive right in and start our evening with a question. So let's start with Neal and Daniel. You guys, what led you to research and study the topics of moonshine and NASCAR? And do you guys decide who you want to go first?
I'm going to let Dan go first.
Okay.
Well, I got, my background is a little strange to be doing this type of stuff because my dad was a Southern Baptist preacher. And so, and fortunately, he's been dead about 20 years, so I'm not sure how he would feel about it. So, I first got interested in NASCAR in 1994 when I was finishing up my PhD in Southern history, and a friend of mine said, I've got tickets to the Bristol night race. And I really didn't know what that meant. And so I went, and so that hooked me. And I think as much as anything, the racing, I really highly recommend Bristol. And you've been at Bristol before, haven't you?
Unfortunately, yeah.
But it's a great place, and just the sensory experience of the racing, but also at that time, in particular, the fans, there was really this burgeoning intensity between Dale Earnhardt Sr. and Jeff Gordon, and it was almost like a morality play, good versus evil. And so I'll never forget, there was a guy, Bristol, you go around the track, about 14 seconds or something like
14,
that.
15, yeah.
And so there was a guy sitting in front of us, and we were way up high. And every time Dale Earnhardt would come by, he'd stand up and flip him the finger. 500 laps, this guy would say, there's something here, And so I wanted to learn more, and so I started, looking into the history and just got fascinated by that. And of course, the moonshine connected with that in a powerful way. And as I put it in the introduction, I was kind of surprised. History people historians are professionally skeptical about everything. And so I'd heard the stories about Moonshine and NASCAR, and I thought, well, that's really overblown and everything. And so I expected to really find that it really wasn't that important. That, yeah, there's Junior Johnson, but, you know, this other stuff, it's just kind of the myth and overblown. But as I put it in the introduction to my book on NASCAR, the deeper I looked, the more liquor I found. And so it really, in so many ways, just permeated the origins of the sport. And so that really got my attention.
It's like a metaphor for life. The deeper I look, the more liquor I found. Well, you know, first I just wanted to quickly say thank you to you guys for coming out. Good to see you all. And big thanks to North Carolina Humanities, to Melissa, to Sherry Paula, to the whole staff for the whole North Carolina Reads program and for doing this on the heels of COVID to get some folks together and talk about books is just awesome. And thanks to Erik for his interest in this book and just reading in general, and for the great work you do at the foundation. It's just been a treat to learn about the work you've been doing, aside from driving really fast on weekends. And thank you guys for coming out. So, you know, my introduction to NASCAR and the stories I write about in Driving with the Devil, I wasn't born here. I was born in New Jersey. I had no connection to the South, but I did grow up in a household where my father was a sort of a gearhead. He always had a car in the garage halfway through some version of, you know, disassembly or reassembly. Even to this day, he's 85 and he's still flying his plane that he built by himself. But he would take my brother and I to races on the weekends. But this is up north, so we would go to, you know, rally races and sports car races, Watkins Glen, Pocono. So I never really had an exposure to NASCAR. But I was working as a newspaper reporter for a bunch of years, and around 2001, 2002, was finishing up my first book, about to like leave newspapers, and started just like collecting, like I do with many of my book projects, articles and information on some topic, and this NASCAR file just kept getting fatter and fatter. I really wanted to know, because at that time it was growing so fast and becoming really more mainstream and more in your face with, you know, not just sponsorships, but TV exposure, and it was just bigger and bigger all the time, right? And more kind of a part of a mainstream culture instead of just Southern culture. And I wanted to know, where did this all start? How did this sport begin? Who were the first racers? Who were the first, you know, team owners? What was the true backstory? And like Dan said, like, I started digging into this, and first I found the Bill France myth, which was that suddenly NASCAR appeared in 1949, and Bill France started it all. And then I came across the other myth, which was, you know, the Moonshiners were the first racers and first team owners. So I wanted to figure out, well, what's true here? What's the real origins of this thing? And so I just started digging. You know, my background in journalism, I'm used to asking annoying questions from people who don't want to talk to me. So I started, we were talking about this earlier, I think with guys, Mike on Erik's crew. I started going to Atlanta to interview this guy named Raymond Parks, who, oh, there he is. No, he's not there, that's Bill France. But Raymond Parks, I consider the true sort of overlooked, he at one point was forgotten, but now he's not. Now he's gotten the recognition he deserves. But really one of the founders of NASCAR and really the true godfathers of stock car racing. I was amazed to discover he was still alive. He was about 90 when I first met him. He still went to work every day in a little office next to the liquor store he still owned on, I think it was Northside Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia. And I started going down there. I lived in Asheville, North Carolina at the time, and would drive down and try and interview Raymond. I was telling this story earlier. And he would say, no, I don't want to talk about that. He would just like shut me off. And I think because I was an outsider and the history that he had been involved in that sport was so long ago, he didn't want to talk about it. Anyway, little by little, he opened up, and his willingness to tell me bits of his story just opened up this whole world of how and where and why stock car racing and NASCAR really started, and how important moonshining and the moonshine runners of the South were to the origins of that sport. So I'll pause there because I don't want to keep rambling, but that's where my interest started, was getting Raymond Parks to open up to me, and then in turn people realize, oh, you talk to Raymond? Okay, I'll talk to you. And little by little I got others to sort of tell me more about the roots of this sport that I think for a long time people were afraid to really talk about in much detail.
So he was your in.
He was my in.
Good
Yep.
stuff. Good
Yep,
stuff.
I was grateful to him.
Well, Erik, let's get you involved as well. So you do all these great things as part of your reading initiative. It's one of the pillars of your charitable foundation. So what led you to want to feature this book as part of your reading initiative?
Well, I was trying to remember where I originally even had come across the book, and I couldn't remember. I don't remember if somebody gave it to me, or I think I may have went and bought it myself, but obviously ended up reading the book a few years back and just loved it. For me, always enjoyed the history of the sport and kind of learning more about it, where it came from, where it started from. So having a book kind of dive into some of the intricacies of it and where it really did come from, like you mentioned, kind of the myth of the Bill France myth that just appeared, and how it was really created and who some of the key players were, was just cool for me, just interesting to me. And as I read through it, obviously knowing a number of people in the sport, I thought, well, this is something that a lot of other people would be interested in as well. And so sent it out one year as a Christmas gift to a handful of people within my group. And just the feedback from it was also positive. It continued to be something that I was interested in and promoting, and obviously fits really naturally with me, in the sport and in NASCAR now. But it was just cool to learn a little bit more about that side of the sport and how it really started and who some of the key players really were.
And so now, when you went out after reading the book, did you fact check some of this stuff? Did you go to the sources and say, "Is this really true?" Or
I never did that, but it is cool to kind of, I'm around a lot of guys that have been around the sport for so long. Obviously, with Richard Petty being my team owner, and then Dale Inman, his crew chief, is around all the time. So it's cool to hear. It's cool to hear stories from them that sometimes mesh up with the book. You hear them tell stories, and you look back on the book, and you're able to kind of line them up, and it all makes sense. And so that's pretty cool when you have that moment.
That's awesome. Nice. That's awesome. So the book obviously details a fascinating history of the stock car racing and its roots from Prohibition-era bootlegging, all the way to what it is now, which is the multi-billion-dollar sport and industry that we know. Out of everything, and this is going to be an interesting question for all three of you, because I think you have very different perspectives, but what was the most surprising thing you learned from the book, either in writing, in researching and reading, or just reading? And let's go straight down the line.
Okay. Well, I may cheat and do too, but first, the first thing was really the moonshine connection, because the thing that, and of course Raymond Parks gets to this in a very powerful way, because not only were all the early drivers, just about all the star drivers in the early days, starting with Lloyd C. and Roy Hall, and going through the Flock brothers and Curtis Turner, and up to, people always started with Junior Johnson, but Junior Johnson was really the kind of the end of the line of the moonshiners. He was one of the last. Yeah. But all the early stars were star drivers, as I put it, got their first high-speed driving experience behind the wheel of a liquor car, hauling liquor. But then, in looking into it, you had the car owners like Raymond Parks and Frank Christian and Hubert Westmoreland. These were all moonshine, big-time bootleggers in many ways. And then promoters, mechanics, Red Boat, being kind of the pioneer there, but people like Buddy Schumann from Charlotte, all the great mechanics in the early years had connections to moonshine as well. And then probably the most startling thing that I found that really surprised me, because there had really been nothing written about this, was that just about all the early track owners, particularly in North Carolina, at North Wilkesboro, at Martinsville, at the old Charlotte Speedway where the first NASCAR race was held, Hickory, Asheville, Weaverville, Hillsboro, a lot of these tracks were built by big-time bootleggers.
Yeah.
And that concerned me a little bit, because I kind of hinted at why they might have done that, and I don't, and I anticipate I might see some lawyers on my doorstep. It's been a number
I
of
think
years,
there's
so
a
I go ahead.
statute of limitations on that. I think they're pretty safe.
Yeah, but basically,
Brian's a lawyer.
That's
He's got-
right. I'm a
he's got-
lawyer.
and I
here,
can't.
yeah. This
and
is
I
all
can't-
privilege. There's
I
nothing.
can't
No
prove
one's
it,
listening.
but
here.
it's pretty apparent it was a great money laundering opportunity for those guys.
It's like
It was-
Ozark way back in the day. Right?
Yeah,
So.
yeah. And so that was really, to me, a big surprise, because I thought it was all a myth. And I guess the other thing, just real quickly, and I think Neal had this experience once he kind of broke through with Raymond Parks, was just how friendly and accessible these people were. And it's refreshing to see Erik, because people will say, oh, did you interview Jeff Gordon, or did you interview, when I said, no, because I stopped in the early 70s, with my book. And so, but the people, Richard Petty, interviewing him was incredible. Ned Jarrett was the first person I interviewed, and he just so friendly, and just, Bobby, I mean, you just go on and on and on. And people like Humpy Wheeler and then Gordon Perkle was just wonderful to interview. And probably my favorite was getting to spend a morning, starting about 6 in the morning, with Junior Johnson at his farm shop, where he fried up every meat known to man, and fed his farm hands, and then some of his old moonshine buddies from Wilkes County. And I said, can I turn the tape recorder on? And then he said, yeah, go right ahead, And so Junior was especially good. I had a rule that I said, before I could call somebody a moonshiner in print or a bootlegger, I had to have 2 on-the-record confirmations. And so I had a number of people that I had one. And so when I interviewed Junior or talked to him, I'd say, a lot of people, Ned Jarrett, and Richard Petty's kind of that way, said, well, I kind of heard that they might have kind of sort of might have been involved, but they wouldn't. Junior would say, oh yeah, he was big time, and then he'd tell you 5 stories about him. I mean, it was great. So he was wonderful to talk to. So that was a very pleasant surprise, just about how accessible. There was one person that wouldn't talk to me unless I paid him money, but I won't say who that was. But
So, Erik, what do you think? Most surprising thing from the book?
It's a handful of things, right? But I mean, I go back and look at, and we're going to touch on this later, and I don't want to get too far into it, but the competition to be the sanctioning body, right? Watching the groups that were all coming up at the same time, trying to take these cars, trying to figure out what the rules were going to be, and kind of how that all came together. And that was pretty interesting to me in a lot of different ways. There's some great stories, obviously, about Bruton Smith in there, and how he kind of became the empire that he was. Some great stories I saw about him obviously building the track, building the speedway in time for the first, what at the time was the World 600, watching those stories and hearing those stories about people coming together and trying to get the money together to make that happen. So there was a lot of different things in there, but I think at the end of it, the competition for the sanctioning bodies was the most interesting to me, because like we mentioned earlier, when you do look at it now, it seems like NASCAR is the end-all, be-all. But it wasn't always that way, and just to see how that all came together was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And Neal, either in researching or I guess even stuff that may not have made the book, what was the most interesting or surprising thing?
The list is way too long,
Yeah.
but I got to start somewhere, right?
Yeah.
So I'll just pick up on what Erik was saying. Like, I was really fascinated to learn. Again, I mentioned earlier, I grew up seeing races up north, more of the sports car style and rally cars. And, I had no idea AAA was a race sanctioning body back in the day and a viable competitor to NASCAR. Like, who would have thought that? This agency that's now, I get their newsletter every month. It's all about car safety and buyer insurance. And, this was like a race sanctioning body back in the day, and then they kind of got snuffed out by Bill France. The competition back then for who's going to lead this scrappy sport into the future. There were all kinds of bodies that were trying to be the leader for what would eventually become one leader, which was NASCAR. I remember being just astounded when I started my research that NASCAR was owned by one family. You know, it's like Major League Baseball or the NFL being created by and owned by one family. I mean, that just doesn't happen. So there are all these just wild bits of history in NASCAR's past that I loved. Mainly, though, for me, it was the characters. Like, it's such a personality-driven sport, and it is to this day. But back then, you know, these characters were guys off the farm. Yep. They didn't want to be, you know, pushing a plow or, you know, working the farm with, in Raymond Parks' case, like 16 kids by, you know, and a drunk dad and poverty like you couldn't believe. And maybe if they were lucky, they made it to the mill or some factory downtown Atlanta or Charlotte. They wanted to get out. They wanted to have fun. They wanted to have an adventure, and they wanted to make money. And the money that these guys made in Moonshine was incredible, like hundreds of dollars a week during the Depression. And then on the weekend, they'd have fun and spin around a dirt track that was either an actual track or just some horse track, or they just make a track themselves, just tear it up. And so to learn about not just the guys who are in my book, like, you know, the two Reds, Red Byron and Red Vogt, and then Raymond, but just colorful characters. The Flock brothers were incredible. And all these names, Gober and Smokey and Legs and Bad Eye and Crash and Cannonball. I mean, it was such a colorful sport, and I think there are a lot of aspects to the creation of that sport that tell us a little bit more about who we are as a country, particularly about the South. But, you know, I was astounded to learn that one reason stock car racing was successful in a number of southern states is because there weren't any professional sports teams. You know, you didn't get the Atlanta Braves until 1965. That was the first pro sport team in the South. Yeah. So there are just so many bits and pieces like that that kind of came together in the book that I was just amazed by.
Are you saying Florida counts? Is that your?
I want to hear. Wait, what was the first team though?
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
No? All right, we'll talk after. But Florida counts, okay. But, you know, I think there are aspects of the history of NASCAR that are the history of the South and then tell us a lot about who we are as a country. Yeah. And last bit of it is what Dan alluded to, you know, that whiskey is so tied into all of that. And I just love learning just how deeply whiskey was involved in the creation of this sport. And Dan summed it up really nicely. Like, it wasn't just a little side thing that some of these guys did now and then. The sport was created by moonshine runners.
I'll tell you, one of the most fascinating things to me in reading about the history in the book is you have a point at which a lot of these guys have to make a decision about how far they're willing to go into the whiskey business, into, you know, running numbers and doing some of these lottery businesses, all these other things that are obviously not legal, but at the same time they're also in love with the sport. And so, you know, where do you draw a line?
Right. Yeah, and then you get Bill France involved, and he's trying to shut it all down. Mm-hmm. He is trying to clean it up and get rid of any of that taint in his mind of the moonshine running. And you see him barring racers and stripping points from any racers he thinks are moonshine runners. Or if they start racing for Bruton Smith's, you know, NSCRA group, he bans them from NASCAR. I mean, he played hardball and did a lot to try and get rid of that aspect of the sport. And I think maybe there was some logic to it because these guys were, you know, criminals in some cases. You know, you could draw the line sort of here or there. Right? Yeah. It's like, is it criminal or is it just like, in their view, it was like bringing a product, you know, crop to market or something. Anyway, but maybe France had to do some of that aggressive maneuvering to keep the sport alive. Mm-hmm. But then I think others would argue that he and then his son and NASCAR in general kind of stripped away too much, and it doesn't have any of that sense of itself left.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of France and Bruton Smith, we were just, talking a little bit about that. In chapter 15 of the book, we talk about the competition between Bill France and Bruton Smith to run just strictly stock races with cars built after World War II. And I guess it was a very intentional decision that these are the cars they're going to use in his race. And then on page 284, it says France's attempt to upstage Smith triggered this rivalry that would last half a century. And NASCAR's first strictly stock race would go down as a huge turning point in the sport. That race, as I think a lot of people who are watching know, happened right here in Charlotte. So what was it about that race, about that decision that was such an inflection point in the sport, in NASCAR, in everything that we now know as the sport today? And I don't know, I mean, do you want to? I know you guys both know. You guys take it.
Yeah, we start the same way.
Well, there are so many things in that race. And again, there was, as Neal's pointed out, there's a very starting in the 30s, Lakewood Speedway, is really kind of, in many ways, kind of the birthplace, you know. And so it's a big deal before the war, and then everything shuts down during the war. And then Bill France is very instrumental in kind of reviving it after the war. But there are other people involved, Sam Nunes in particular, and then a very young Bruton Smith, who comes along during that time period. And so it's a very competitive situation. And so that first race, which I think, as we mentioned, was over off of Little Rock Road in West Charlotte. And just right off the interstate, you can kind of see some of the vestiges of the old Charlotte Speedway that was built by a couple of bootleggers, the Charles brothers, on a farm there. And but it was important in lots of ways. Again, there was a very thriving stock car racing scene, and they were driving what they call modifieds, or I guess now, and so the rules weren't as tight, and so, but this idea was kind of spinning around, and Bruton Smith was one of those that were talking about this, about having a series that featured new or relatively new cars, and so this was the big thing with that quote, strictly, which is an interesting
since World War II, is that the?
Yeah, I think it was 46 to 49,
okay.
I think, were the the eligible cars, and so and it's just an incredible story. If you got to just about the, Lee Petty. I mean, borrowing a car from a neighbor. I mean, how many people, and then rolling the car. They couldn't even drive it back to a level cross. It was so torn up in the race, and so and then the whole situation. And I can't think of who it was that won the race, but it was Hubert Westmoreland was the owner, and he was a big-time bootlegger, and they disqualified the car because of illegal modifications. But Neal talked about this, about a big thing was that Bill France won a number of important court cases in the aftermath of that really solidified his hold on stock car racing at that time. And
well, I can jump in and then hand it off to you if that works for you, Eric, because I think I think it's fascinating that we're here talking about this because it ties in so much to the team you're on and your role in the sport now. That the through line is like from then to you, and Bruton Smith is a big part of it. That race I think was a fascinating moment in time for some of the reasons Dan pointed out, and not just because it was the beginnings of quote unquote strictly stock, which is not strictly stock at all, but the fact that the winner, the guy who crossed the finish line first, was disqualified because he was a bootlegger, and they found some evidence that this was a bootlegger's car. So this is Bill France asserting his authority over the sport and trying to get rid of the bootleggers. My guy, Red Byron, who's on the cover of the book, came in third that day. I can't remember who won either. I want to say Burton, Jim.
it was it Jim Roper?
Roper, that sounds good, yeah.
You saw it in the Smiling Jack comic strip, something about advertising for the race.
Oh, that's
It was from
great.
Kansas.
But there was so much else going on that year, and it all kind of revolved around that race. You've got Bruton Smith trying to maintain his own series, the NSCRA. You've got, NASCAR, which was just 18 months old at that time. They had just finalized things at the famous meeting at the Streamline Hotel in the end of 47. So then you're into, 49 when this race takes place, and NASCAR is just brand new. And France is just playing hardball with everybody. So we had talked about this earlier. He had kicked out 5 NASCAR racers because they had raced in Bruton Smith's series, and because he thought that, I forget the term, but like something about being disreputable to the sport.
They had supposedly thrown thumbtacks on the track or something. I think that was kind of made up. But
Yeah.
I don't know. Have you done that before?
No, I haven't.
You might consider it.
Yeah, I might have to give it a shot.
So anyway, there was just so much that happened that race, that year, that set up what was to come later. And I was trying to remember, there's this one quote, Raymond Parks, who was at the famous Streamline Hotel meeting, who had been involved in the sport since the 30s, who was friends with Bill France. Bill France actually raced for him a couple times. He funded Bill France race cars and funded NASCAR early on, too. But his comment to me at one point, as it relates to sort of Bill France taking over around the time of that race, was, we had the know-how, but Bill France had the lawyers. And, that was the beginning of Bill France taking over the sport for his family. And it also, as you pointed out in your question, set up this long-time rivalry with Bruton Smith, who I had no idea was still alive. I think it's amazing that he just passed away last night because he's been so influential in this sport. And I think it's wild that he was able to stay involved in the sport for so long and not get trounced by France and NASCAR and the France family. He had his various racetracks and stayed viable for many, many years. And then the other cool thing about that race, as Dan pointed out, Lee Petty races. So, you draw a direct line from Lee Petty to today's 43 car. And I think this is the stuff I love about the sport. It still feels like alive and vibrant to me.
I wouldn't be surprised to ask Richard about the race. He was probably there.
I think he was there.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah.
Right.
And
They
so,
had to hitch a ride home.
yeah, for sure. Well, Richard talks about all the time, hopping in, taking the race car to the racetrack, and how they would drive to the racetrack. And years down the road, too, would drive from North Carolina to California and drive right back after the race. So it's crazy to hear those stories. But another part, like you mentioned, too, it was crazy to me to learn how long, and the Smith family is still heavily involved in the sport.
Yeah.
From that moment on, how much Bruton really had a major influence on NASCAR.
Yeah.
Even from that point on, was pretty interesting to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking about through lines and some of the history and all the Moonshine stuff. Now, as all of you know, the idea of hard liquor getting back into NASCAR through sponsorships has really taken hold over the last couple of years. And just as an example, there are companies like Howlerhead Bourbon that's on the Ross Chastain #1 Chevy car. There's Alex Bowman 48 that also got a multi-year deal with Day Chaser. There's Tennessee Sugarland Distilling Company that created High Rock Vodka with Dale Earnhardt and his wife as sort of spokespeople for that. And I could go on. There's Midnight Moonshine, inspired by Junior Johnson. So it seems like the history is again getting embraced here. I guess, given those sponsorships and partnerships, what do you guys think about that as a sort of a future story? Where do you think this is going? And do you think it's good for NASCAR, or do you think there are risks?
I think it's funny to see because, I've talked to Richard before about it, and he actually made a promise to his mom that he would never accept sponsorship money from an alcohol company.
Wow.
Yeah, they didn't do the Busch Clash for years.
Yeah.
Do
We
they
do now.
do
So
now? Okay.
Richard's lightened up a little bit on it as we've moved along. But he did that. He made a promise to his mom he wouldn't accept sponsorship money from any kind of alcoholic sponsorship. So it's funny to go all those years and still see that kind of ingrained, but obviously we see it turning the other way and coming back. You know, really, I think it's a good thing at this point to kind of embrace that history. People like that kind of outlaw spirit of the sport, right? You know, and that's something now you can look back on and see as something that was neat how it came about. And really, I think it even influences people to learn a little bit more about NASCAR. You know, there's probably people coming in now that don't even realize, coming in as fans, where we really came from, and that can be a kind of a bridge gap for us.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I do think, you know, one of the things that NASCAR has struggled with in recent years is maintaining its sort of core fan base, and maintaining a connection to its past. And I think they've had this weird, complicated back and forth relationship with its past, including the Moonshine piece of it. Like, at times they're like proud of it, and at times they're like downplay it, and they're afraid of it. And I've seen that over the years and find it just wild. You know, they banned liquor sponsorships for many years. I don't know when it started, but I know it ended in 2005. And then you'd see, you know, every couple of years, the trend was like up and down, up and down. Now it seems to be on a little bit of an upswing. But I do think, you know, allowing that is a way to connect with fans, a way to acknowledge, hey, all right, this is where we came from. It's okay. We don't have to be afraid of it. We don't have to. I mean, I get the intent to be a family-friendly sport, but at the same time, you can go too far with that and alienate, you know, your own history. And I think they've like run the risk of doing that at times.
Yeah, it was interesting doing research on it because Bill France interviews Senior were always, well, both of them were very interesting, and it was always asked these questions about Moonshine, and he always deflected, you know, and said, well, you know, maybe there were one or two people or something like that, you know, and so, and of course, you know, my research became all about that, and I actually just happened to look today, and the last paragraph of my book, it says, a great temptation for the historian is to write prescriptive history and assume to advise people in the present how they should live and act based on that historian's version of the past. Indeed, NASCAR has done pretty well without my advice and made incredible strides in the world of professional sports in its more than 60 years of existence. However, at the risk of being prescriptive, I would encourage NASCAR officials, drivers, corporate sponsors, and fans to look to the sport's past not as a source of embarrassment to be ignored or whitewashed, but as a source of pride to be appreciated, welcomed, and even honored. I would humbly suggest that it is time for NASCAR to stop, quote, modernizing tradition, which was kind of a catchphrase at the time, and start embracing its tradition. And I've been very pleased in recent years that they have. Now, I do wish, because Martinsville is the one of those tracks that's left that was started by Clay Earls, who was a big-time bootlegger, and instead of the grandfather clocks, I think they should give, like, you know, maybe miniature stills or something like that.
For sure.
Or even Clay Earls, you know, this kind of recognition of his, he always kept on his office wall a framed pair of brass knuckles. And so,
That's cool.
you know, so that type of thing, I think, is, and people love it, you know, that's the thing. I thought, you know, it's always mystified me why they've kind of run from that in many ways, because people are so fascinated by the history and by those great, I mean, and again, you know, I think Neal and I were attracted in the same way to this because there's so many great stories here, you know, and, you know, I think those stories ought to be told, you know.
Erik, does it come up at all in your dealings with other drivers or the Petty family? Like, what's your sense of how, you know, other drivers like you or people in the whole community of NASCAR think about that, the past and the connection to the whiskey and all that?
I think most of us embrace it now. I would say the current generation and crop of drivers, you know, we're far enough removed at this point. You know, none of us really have connections with anybody from that time, right?
Yeah.
I had a guy I worked with at one point. He was still involved in Moonshine, I don't want to talk about it because he was really weird about it and didn't really want to talk about it. So it's still around, There's still guys in the sport that were around in that time and were involved in Moonshine. And he would show up to the racetrack with his Moonshine and show it off and then be selling it to people. So it was cool, You still see that around. But for me coming in, that was kind of neat, right? Like I was 20, 21 at the time. And to see that still connection from that time, that was really neat. So to look at it now from my side, I think it's embraced and welcomed. It's just cool to see that side of the sport because you don't see it anymore and you don't really get to hear those stories too much.
Yeah, that's great.
So your book came out in, was it 07? Looks like, I think it was published in 07-ish.
Yeah, maybe, anyway,
Okay,
06 for the hardcover.
And your last NASCAR book was around probably that time, or?
Yeah, 2010.
2010.
And then one that has a chapter on NASCAR
Okay.
that came out in 2019.
So, well, then you probably could answer this question better than these guys, but I'd be very interested to hear if you had to add a chapter, if you after 07 all the way up to now, what is the theme? What is the sort of the big changes that you would talk about in NASCAR, if you were writing this book 50 years from now? What would people look back and see? What's happening? What's the important stuff going on right now?
I would say kind of the corporate takeover, right? I'm sure you guys are kind of thinking the same thing, but at that moment in time, I think 2005 to 2008 was really that moment. That was when the Fortune 500 companies jumped in, they were all in, and that really molded and changed personalities within the sport quite a bit. You went from, the good old boys, right? Come in and race, say kind of whatever you wanted and throw your personality out there. And now, I look at coming in the sport. I first joined the Truck Series in 2013. The first thing I did right away, I went to media training, and it's no different now. I mean, young guys coming in, they go to media training. I went to media training for, 3 years in a row, right? And so obviously I don't think when Junior Johnson showed up to race, he was doing that. So, I would just, there would be there would be multiple chapters on how that's kind of went over the last 10 or 15 years. But I would say that's the big thing that's really changed.
I would say that the move from being really a strictly family business that was, for lack of a better word, dictated by, whoever the head of the France family was at the time, to where, the France family is still very much there, but I think they've been, and this is always a challenge, particularly, there seems to be a basic rule that once you get into the third generation, things start to fall apart, and you see this in a lot of family businesses, but, I think particularly very recently, they've kind of moved a lot of those important management decisions to other folks, and I think it's NASCAR's benefited, I think, from that. Because you had two incredibly talented individuals, very, very different in some ways, but in Bill France and Bill Jr., and their legacy will always be there. But again, that just the odds are against continuing to produce that type of individual in a family, and so I think that's been a big change. Again, France family's still there, very, very apparently, but it's probably changed since you came into the sport.
Yeah, quite a bit. When I first came in, Brian was still really running the show, which Brian's not really involved anymore, but there are a lot of different people in charge now than when I first came in, and it's actually been a really positive change. I think it has. We've done a lot of, the sport's changing a lot right now. We're going to a lot of different venues. We've obviously went to a new race car. So there's a lot of different things going on right now, and those have all really been driven by the people you were talking about kind of coming in and really taking control of what's going on. So it's been interesting, over the last 10 years to watch that change.
I think the next 10 will be fascinating too, to fill out that next chapter of the book that you asked about. I think the story's not done. We're still seeing the evolution of this sort of wild up and down roller coaster ride of this sport. And when I finished the book, it was about the time that you're talking about when things were really becoming more corporate and so much money was being poured into the sport. TV contracts and sponsorships and huge salaries for drivers and corporate, big corporations paying attention to the sport. And it just reached this like frenzied pitch, this nutty period of time. And then, there was a period of time a few years ago where it kind of leveled out and questions being raised about how sustainable things were, trying to continue to be a nationwide sport. And then other questions being raised by, the hardcore fans about the sport moving away from sort of embracing its past and who the original fans were. And so I think that's starting to balance itself out a little bit, but I think the next 10 years will tell us a lot about whether it survives and what it looks like. Like I don't even have a sense right now what's viewership like. How's that trending and attendance at races? Is that up or down? When I left sort of paying attention on a daily basis, it was just through the roof. It was just going like it would never stop. Now it's kind of...
We would love to be at the numbers that we were at then. I would say an average race for us is, the Daytona 500 obviously always pulls in great viewership, but 4 million viewers for us on an average Sunday race. And we're at a big turning point too. We're coming up on a new TV contract, which TV money runs the sport more than a lot of people think. So that's going to be a big change too, kind of where that goes here in I think 3 years, 2025. So there's a lot of, like you said, the next 10 years is going to be very indicative of where we go as a sport, and the TV contract's going to have a big say in that. That is our audience, right? What's being shown on TV, that is really directing the audience quite a bit. So I don't know, it's interesting. Live sports are changing a lot. Just all live sports are changing a lot. But our crowds have been great this year, which is awesome. Seeing a lot of people, getting back out. People just want to get out and do something, and that's represented, I think, on the weekends for us. But the next 10 years are going to be interesting for sure.
So Erik, how has that changed in terms of interacting with media or social media or doing all of that sort of thing over the course of your career? I mean, are you on Twitter? Are you on all of these things, and are you using that to promote your brand and things like that?
Yeah, it's pretty big. I would say the sponsorship model is heavily based around that. It's not so much anymore putting the sticker on the race car and going to race. I mean, that's what it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Now there's so much value, so much more value wanted out of that sponsorship. Obviously, being on the car and on TV is great, but you see the world changing in the sense of social media influencers are huge now. The money that they bring in is the money we want to bring in for sponsorship on our race car, right? And they're getting paid that to make YouTube videos and everything else. So we have to find our way. So does your
TikTok, would we see a good TikTok video?
I don't have a TikTok. I do have a Twitter and an Instagram, but they're asking more of us in that world, and not necessarily to be a total social media influencer, but we do have a pull there. Obviously, we have a cool job, right? I mean, we get to be a race car driver, so they want to be able to share that online and share more of that way.
Well, we're going to open it up to questions soon, but before we do that, I want to know what's next for everybody here. So let's just, I know y'all are working on some great projects, charity initiatives, races, research, things like that. So if you could just give me, a couple of minutes on what you're doing now and like what you're excited about.
I'll go.
Yeah.
Sure. I'm a historian and writer, and so I'm always onto some new project. And I just had a book that came out earlier this year called The First Kennedys. I was explaining to someone earlier, I think it was my attempt to do what I did for this NASCAR book, where I went back to the beginnings of the famous Kennedy family and tried to figure out where did they actually come from? What's the true story? Peel away some of the mythology and figure out, how and why did they come to America? So it's the story of the first Kennedys coming to America. They were Irish immigrants in the 1840s and focuses on this woman, Bridget Murphy Kennedy, who opened a grocery store after losing her husband and be working as a maid for a bunch of years, selling liquor on the side.
So see, it all comes back.
It all comes back to
back to
liquor.
the MASH in Ireland, right?
Exactly. And then, and now I'm researching a new book about World War II and spies. I'll leave it at that.
Great stuff.
Yeah, thanks.
Erik?
Yeah, we are obviously hot and heavy in race season right now. We had our first off weekend last weekend, but you know, we're on to that into November. But we did have our first charity event it's coming up on a month ago now, actually up in Michigan where I was from. We had our first event raising money for the Melanoma Research Foundation, which was a great event, had a great turnout, a lot of people. We're starting to kind of plan our next event, which looks like it's going to be next spring down here in North Carolina, so we're working on that pretty hard. But yeah, just doing the racing deal right now, taking up you know, every weekend up here until November. But
Great stuff. And this weekend, you said, where are you in
Nashville.
Nashville, that's
yeah,
what I thought.
Yep, so, Sunday afternoon.
Good luck.
Good luck.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Before I talk about what I'm doing, I want to talk about this guy right here. So one of the things I guess that I learned in doing this was there is this kind of notion about race car drivers that I can do that. You can't. This guy, well, as Richard Petty would say, he's a different kind of cat. And he looks very normal, nice, clean-cut guy.
Thank you.
But you can't. What these people do is you cannot be good unless you are willing, and this was true in 1937, it's true today. You cannot be good unless you're willing to go to the very edge of control. And I don't know, Erik, I don't know that anyone successfully explained it.
No, I mean, it is hard to describe. I mean, you know, it's funny, I take people on a lot of ride-alongs and in pace cars before the race, which pace cars is just a street car.
And make them pee in their pants.
Well, you know, they can't believe how much the car can take. And for me, it's like it's not even
Right.
close
You're not pushing
to the
it, so.
limit. I mean, we're just cruising around, and people are like, I can't even believe the car's handling this. So, but you got to magnify that times, you know, 1,000. I mean, you're out there with the rest of the field. There's 39 other guys out there. You're going 150 miles an hour faster. So you kind of add everything up. But, you know, it is interesting you say that, though, because other sports, I mean, I know I can't play golf like Tiger Woods, right? Like, I have golf clubs. I golf. I can't hit it like he does. Basketball, baseball, any of those sports, you can pick that up and say, well, I can't do what that guy does. But you can't go hop in, you know, a cup car and say, well, let me give it a shot.
Yeah.
So that is the kind of the link in our sport that's a little different.
Yeah,
That's
but again, that's an illusion, people, trust me on that. I guess I did a book in 2019 on Moonshine in North Carolina, which was a lot of fun, and there's a chapter on how NASCAR and stock car racing fits into all that, but that was a lot of fun to do. And since then, I've gone a weird direction. I've done some coffee table books with a poster artist named Joel Anderson, who's in Nashville, who's just incredible, has an incredible business, and our most recent one is actually on Utah and Arizona, and so they're kind of guidebooks and history and all kinds of stuff. But the thing that I've been working on most recently is kind of a departure. I live at Ridgecrest. If you've been to Asheville on I-40, you go up the mountain from Old Fort, and what people don't see is off to the north of there is a railroad line that was built in the 1870s. And it's 9 miles of track. It's world famous actually for railroad buffs. But it was built by convict labor back in the 1870s, and so there's no acknowledgement, really public acknowledgement of that. So a group of folks and I have gotten together and have created something called the Rail Memorial Project, where our original goal was to build a memorial to the people that built the railroad, and we actually had a dedication back in October, and that was, and we're very proud of that. From then, we thought we were done, and then we started getting, as a historian, this is kind of weird, got into ground penetrating radar and human remains detection dogs, and so we discovered some mass grave. There are at least 139 of these primarily African-American convicts who died in the process of building this railroad. And so we found some, what we believe are mass graves. And so we're going to mark those and memorialize those. So that's been my most kind of recent thing there, kind of a really weird departure, but you never know where, Neal, right, where these things are going to go.
Cool. I like that.
Yeah. As a historian, you never know where the story's going to
Right.
take you.
Yeah,
As
never,
a journalist,
I never
yeah.
expect to be working with dogs, that's for sure.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you for an incredible conversation. I think we have some time for a couple of questions. So if in the audience, if you have any questions, I don't think we can take anything from home, but let's see. It's a little tough to see out there.
If you've got a question, myself, I'm
Yes.
Melissa, and my colleague Megan have some microphones.
I see a gentleman right down here who's got one with the greenish shirt.
Yes, that's my husband.
Okay, there you go. Well, hold on one second. Let's get the mic so people at home can hear you.
So thank you, everybody. I learned a lot tonight. But my question's for Erik. You've driven a lot of different cars and trucks in your day. What do you think it would have been like going back in time and driving a car bootlegging back in history?
Great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. I don't know. I've wondered, not even just that generation. I've wondered through all the generations what it would be like to drive those race cars, from the 40s up until the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. But I don't know. I've seen video of those races, and I've talked to Richard, who was a little bit removed from that, but his dad obviously was around for that, so he knows kind of how it was. But it's crazy hearing the stories about how they set those cars up. They were stock until they obviously manipulated them towards what they wanted. But Richard was telling a story one time. They were racing on the beach, and he got hit really hard in the left rear, which ended up moving the suspension quite a bit. And he's like, well, it drove a lot better after that. And they didn't understand why. But what it was wedge, right? To now is so simple to us. But that was kind of how they were figuring things out and learning things. So would have just been a cool era to be in, to be learning that quick and that fast. Now in the sport, we know so quickly and kind of what everything does. We have the technology, right, to figure that out and what this change is going to do. We can put it in the sim, and it's going to kind of tell us how it's going to work. So there is no magic or fascination with that like there was back then. So that would be the cool part about driving those cars. But as far as how they drove, I don't know. It would, you talk about the mindset we have. It would have been an even more different one, which I guess you wouldn't know any better. But about the safety of those cars and how you did it. I mean, Richard would, he told me for a long time he raced in a T-shirt and jeans with the leather helmet. So
Smokey Unit would put it. He said they'd give you about as much protection as a turtle shell.
Yeah, yeah. So that would have been the crazy part for me, for sure.
All right, great. Do we have any other questions?
got
I
another
think
one.
we've got a young fan down here.
The Walt hat there.
This is for Erik. What was your favorite NASCAR driver growing up as a kid?
That's a good question.
My favorite driver growing up was Jeff Gordon. So he was really the guy when I was a kid. He was winning all the races and kind of coming in as the new kid. As I started to get older, I read one of his early biographies and kind of about how he got started. I actually didn't read it. My dad read it to me. But about how he got started in racing, and that was pretty inspirational. I was just getting started racing at the time, and I was 7, 8 years old. He started racing when he was 7. I was racing quarter midgets. He was racing quarter midgets, so I was like, well, this is really cool. And to think, okay, well, he could do it, and he grew up and found his way to NASCAR. How can I do that? So that was kind of, he was already my favorite, but that was really the point for me that instilled him as being my guy for sure.
Did y'all overlap at all? Did you ever get to race with him?
One time, yeah, I made my first Cup start in 2015 as a fill-in, and Kyle Busch was injured, and I got in his car in Kansas and raced, and I started right next to him, actually. I qualified, I think I don't remember, 10th or 12th, and either way, wherever it was, he had started right side by side with me. So I got to race with him, and that was really cool. You know, I didn't get to meet him until that year, actually, in person and talk with him, but, you know, pretty cool just to know him now as a, you know, on a first name basis, get to talk to him, hang out with him. That was pretty cool getting to race with him.
Did you beat him that day?
No, I crashed. I beat him most of the day. I was ahead of him until like 60 or 70 to go, and then I was way behind him.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, if anyone else has a question out there. Okay.
We got one down here.
Oh,
Neal, so what kind of reaction did you get from your colleagues after you wrote Driving with the Devil? Did you find some closet race fans, or were there some people who were wondering, like, what rabbit hole did you go down?
Well, when I was doing the research and when I picked up my whole family from Baltimore and moved them to North Carolina to do the research, there were some questions about my sanity and, you know, what was I thinking? When the book came out, this isn't exactly your question, but I found it fascinating that NASCAR's reaction was a little, as you might imagine, mixed. There were some folks who loved it and loved that it was reviving this part of their history, and I think I mentioned at the tail end of the book, I tried really hard to get comments from, you know, Bill Jr., I can't remember, I think Bill Sr. was sick at that time, if not passed away, I can't remember. But anyway, I tried to get comments from the family, and there was a brief period where they were like a little bit interested, and they were maybe going to set up a meeting, and then they must have talked to somebody and realized that this was all about moonshine, and they said no. They were done. But friends and colleagues, I think one of the things that I tried to do at the front end of the book was think, all right, I'm interested in this, and I wanted to do two things in writing the book. Tell NASCAR fans, people who actually knew the sport, some bits and pieces that they didn't know. Like, you know, here's maybe going a little bit deeper into the older past and the history of the story. So tell NASCAR fans something they didn't know about the sport, and tell the rest of the world why it matters. Like why the sport is tied to our nation's history, and, you know, how important the moonshine running is, not just to the sport, but liquor, like, it's a through line through this whole country. Like the Kennedy book I mentioned, there's liquor there. It's just, there's so many interesting pieces to that aspect of our history. So, yeah, the reaction was like, cool, okay, Neal, thanks.
Well, I have a question. How long did it take to write?
Probably a good 3 years. You know,
That's counting the research.
The research mainly, yeah. I think once I sat down to start writing, the writing came kind of fast, but the research took me a lot of time. You know, some of the things we touched on today about the reluctance.
Once you get Raymond Parks talking.
And then I got Raymond Parks talking, and that opened some doors. You know, oh, Raymond, you're talking to Raymond? Okay, I'll talk to you.
Best interview? Which one? Who do you think?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Oh man, there were so many. It has to be Raymond, because I spent so much time with him. Again, just going to his liquor store in Atlanta and showing up again and again, saying, "Hey, Raymond, you want to talk?" "No, not really." And then he started talking. He was great, and his wife was super supportive of the whole project. I loved meeting his family. You know, I mentioned this guy, Bad Eye Shirley. Lost his eye on a barbed wire fence, and he was a good friend of Raymond's and a liquor runner with him, and there were just so many great characters. Junior Johnson was super helpful, met with him a couple times. Yeah, I just loved it. I don't think I can pick a favorite interview. They were just all great.
Well, are you wrapping up? Okay.
Yes. My name is Melissa Giblin. I'm director of North Carolina Center for the Book at North Carolina Humanities, and I want to thank Brian Kahn for moderating this evening's event, as well as Neal, Erik, and Daniel for their thoughtful conversation, and to all of you for joining us this evening. So give our moderator and panelists a round of applause. And to wrap up this evening, it's my pleasure to reintroduce Sherry Paula Watkins for concluding remarks.
Thanks, Melissa. And I don't know about you, but I know for myself, I have thoroughly enjoyed this. Not only am I understanding stock car racing, NASCAR, riding it, interviewing folks, but my own history of being a Carolina girl. My mother from North Carolina, my father from South Carolina. And just not only, better understanding a sport and the history and how it still is being carried on, but hearing Erik Jones here tonight of what the future is going to be, and I can only say it's got to be bright because here's Erik Jones and he started this foundation, and so I just am really curious 10 years from now what we're going to be talking about here at North Carolina Humanities and what historians are going to capture about the racers like Erik Jones. So really excited about tonight. Erik, I look forward to seeing you on the track. And Neal and Daniel, I can't wait to start reading your new books, but also the other ones that you all have referenced as well that I haven't read yet. Thank you for being here tonight, for choosing us to spend some time with, both online but in person here. It means so much to us, and for you all to gather in person really is a marked point for us as the North Carolina Humanities. We couldn't thank you enough for being here, but also just celebrating our North Carolina Reads program and what Melissa Giblin has put together all summer, and to conclude it with this summer program, and really just celebrating the power of reading books in our communities that take time to come together and talk about things that really matter. If you haven't already done so, we invite you to visit the lobby before you leave to enter to win a copy of Neal and Daniel's books and pick up some swag from North Carolina Humanities. And thank you again, and we hope to see you at another program. And don't forget to log on to our website and share links of these programs with your friends and families, and maybe start your own community discussion about stock car racing in North Carolina. Thank you.